Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. It was great seeing so many of you in both London and Paris over the past few weeks. Last year during Frieze London, I couldn't believe how many times I was asked if I'm going to Paris. There was almost this sense of paranoia in London, a concern that Paris might be overtaking it as Europe's primary art capital. But this year, London really rose to the occasion. Beyond the Frieze Fair, the gallery shows were the real highlight. They were absolutely incredible. I honestly can't recall such a strong lineup. In the Kerry James Marshall exhibition at the Royal Academy might have been the best thing I saw over the 2 weeks. And meanwhile, who doesn't love being in Paris? Art Basel Paris really is maturing as a fair. The Grand Palais is without a doubt one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful venues for an art fair anywhere in the world. And the quality of art, it truly feels like it's Basel quality. Yet the fair itself actually remains more manageable than Basel Miami or Switzerland. It's big enough to feel important and to spend the day there, but it isn't an overwhelming and daunting task to try to go through it all. From a market standpoint, the energy felt solid. It wasn't a complete sellout fair, but strong work seemed to move relatively easily. To help us break down these 2 weeks in Europe, we're joined by Arun Kakar, Senior Art Market Editor at Artsy. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Arun, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I know it was a really busy time for you covering everything happening for Artsy in London and then Paris, so I appreciate you taking some time to help us break everything down. So I remember last year at Frieze in London, so many galleries and collectors, they were asking me, are you going to Paris? Are you going to Paris? It felt like everyone wanted to know who was going to Paris, who was going to be in London, and it felt like there was a little bit of uncertainty and maybe even some anxiety about London's place as the art capital in Europe and if there was a shift potentially happening to Paris. But it seems like this year, London Frieze Week was a huge success. Many have been calling it the London comeback. Beyond the fair, there were so many great gallery exhibitions and museum shows. Do you think the London comeback narrative is accurate? And what felt different to you about London this time compared to recent years?
Sure, yeah. I thought Frieze Week was fantastic this year. There was so much to see, from standout museum shows all the way through to really, really good gallery shows. A lot of bars, and the fair itself, I really enjoyed. There was some really interesting presentations in the focus section, which is dedicated to emerging galleries, through to the gallery section itself. And Frieze, of course, is split into two fairs: Frieze London, which is more of the contemporary side of things, and Frieze Masters, where you get more of that art historical scope. Artworks ranging from the 20th century all the way back through to kind of ancient artifacts and things like that. And I think this was a year, I mean, you mentioned the phrase there, Adam, London comeback. I think I'd maybe use the phrase, well, not as snappy as that, but like a London reassertion, I suppose. This was a year in which London's art scene kind of reminded visitors and even locals like myself alike about its strength in depth, and really just how much of a community there is in London when it comes to galleries, collectors, and people in the art world. But the quality on view, I think, just to point out to a couple of main points here, I think London's gallery ecosystem, particularly of young galleries, is really one of the leading gallery scenes in the world. And we were reminded of that fact both at the fair and outside. So galleries like Rose Easton, Ginny and Frederick, Public Gallery, these are galleries that are really causing buzz beyond the fair, and kind of making waves sort of internationally as well. It's certainly something that you hear people talking about when they talk about London. I mean, people who are interested in the art world. It's a real point of differentiation globally. and something that is really worth celebrating. And I think Frieze has done a really good job of celebrating that with its focus section. As mentioned, the focus section is dedicated to galleries under the age of, I believe it's 12. And unlike other fairs in which the emerging gallery sections or younger gallery sections are positioned kind of perhaps separately from the main gallery section, Frieze places its emerging gallery section at the front of the fair to the left as you enter. And that really kind of is a statement of intent from the fair organizers, really. Showing its commitment to emerging galleries, shining a light on kind of some of the more experimental booths that you would see at an art fair, less painting in this section, kind of more installations, and of course platforming those younger galleries. So I think that all kind of made for like a really sort of interesting experience for visitors and for locals, like a reminder of just how much there is to see in London and how kind of important Frieze is as a platform for these sorts of galleries too, and these sorts of artists as well. Frieze is really a bona fide cultural event in London, and I say this as a Londoner with a lot of friends not in the art world. People talk about Frieze at the front of the Evening Standard, our local paper, and all that sort of stuff. So it felt really buoyant. And just a point on the gallery shows, you saw some really standout gallery shows across town, as well as some brilliant museum shows too.
I think you described it perfectly. And really, at the end of the day, the artists are in London, the galleries are in London. And when you have a lineup of so many fantastic gallery exhibitions occurring at the same time throughout the city, that's what really reminds you how special London is and how important it is as an art capital. It isn't just necessarily about this temporary art fair week that occurs once a year.
Yeah, and I think also with the mood difference, and you're certainly right in saying that there was a kind of distinction. There is a distinction in mood between this year and last year. I mean, the market is where it's at, and I'm sure, and I know on your podcast you speak a lot about where we are in the market right now, and that's of course affecting the London market as well. But I think the difference between this year and last year was that sales were moving at a better pace. And, you know, while some of those challenges remain, you know, galleries were talking about discussions with collectors and potential clients on purchases, running that little bit longer, and things like that, you know, they were ultimately the sense I got and what was reported from galleries. Sales were stronger this year, and expectations have been readjusted as well. Galleries are tailoring their expectations to what potential clients and visitors to Frieze perhaps have expectations for as well. There's a kind of meeting in the middle. And that was noticeable really just from, you know, I mean, I'm sure, Adam, you're aware of, or have done this before, where you go around the fair on the VIP day and it's all very, you know, reported sales here and everyone's kind of just happy to be there. And particularly at Frieze, it's a real kind of buzz around the place. But you go back a couple of days later and you get a real sense of the mood. And I definitely noticed going back a couple of days later at Frieze, the mood was still bright, and certainly much brighter than it was last year.
So let's shift to Paris for a minute. Of course, the following week after Frieze was Art Basel Paris, and the main topic of conversation heading into the week, I think, was the introduction of this new VVIP preview that occurred a day before the traditional opening of Basel Paris. I think there was a lot of talk heading into the fair if this would be successful or not. Do you think that experiment worked? And how did collectors and galleries respond to that new structure?
So, yeah, this was the Avant-Première. I know I've butchered that pronunciation there, but this was, yeah, I mean, you mentioned a VVIP day. It took place from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. on the Tuesday, the day before the kind of standard, quote unquote, first choice opening, which is the general VIP day, I guess you could call it now. So, yeah, this was kind of, galleries were able to invite a select number of top clients to visit, and the intention, I spoke with the director Clément Delépine a couple of days before, was he mentioned the intention of the move was to ensure that galleries had more face time with their most important clients. That in previous VIP days, or first choice days I should say, there was a kind of limited amount of face time they were able to have because it was just so busy. So, in that respect, and given the intention and the stated intention from the organisers, it was a huge success. Galleries reported that they were able to have that much coveted face time with their clients, and sales were happening. The mood. I don't know if you were there yourself, Adam, but the mood on the day certainly felt much more seriously transactional. Sorry, certainly felt much more transaction minded. You could see deals being taking place around you, which I guess that kind of gets lost in the noise of a general VIP day, but it felt like a very distilled commercial success. Things were happening, deals were moving, and yeah, a lot of galleries reported some very, very strong sales on those hours during those hours. One thing I would add as well is that a lot of galleries reported to me a couple of days later that clients were coming back to the fair, and that's always been a challenge, or a challenge that has been noted about Art Basel Paris, is that it's in Paris, and there's so much else to do, so much great food to eat, so many things to see, that a challenge the fair might have would be getting clients to come back to the fair. But given the tighter window, the 4 hour slot, collectors were looking at work on the Tuesday and then returning back a day or two later to confirm purchases or come back in and make kind of a decision on work that they were kind of viewing. Because 4 hours simply isn't enough time to kind of see everything. It's a massive fair. The Grand Palais is a huge venue. So it was really, in that sense, yeah, it went pretty well. Of course, there were some sort of rumblings and complaints here and there, but I think on the whole, generally, I think it was a great success.
Yeah, I agree. I was there that day at the VVIP, and I thought the 4 hour time window was interesting. It felt long enough to really experience part of the fair, but short enough that it encouraged people, I think most people, to come back the next day because it just wasn't enough time to see the whole fair. And overall, I thought it was a success. Before the fair, a lot of galleries I spoke with, they were a bit hesitant about having to work an extra day because this expanded the duration of the fair by a day. And some, of course, mentioned they didn't receive enough tickets from Art Basel, so some of their clients were frustrated about not getting access to that day. During those 4 hours, I did notice that a lot of the major, more blue chip type galleries, their booths were located for the most part in the center of the fair, and they did seem quite busy, maybe because of their location, but also, of course, because they're very popular galleries with a lot of well-known artists. But then you visited other galleries that weren't the blue chippiest of them, if you will, and it wasn't empty, but you felt like you could actually visit the booth and see the art clearly and have really nice, positive conversations with galleries. So that was a definitely different feeling than a typical Basel opening, but I really enjoyed that. Some galleries afterwards actually told me that they would like to see this return, and maybe even for a longer period, maybe 6 hours or 7 hours. So I think that could be interesting. I definitely think it was successful. I definitely think they're going to do it again next year. I could be wrong, but that's just my takeaway. I'm curious to see if it's 4 hours again or if it's potentially even longer.
It did feel compressed, didn't it? The 4 hour time thing. Do you think they'll replicate it for other Art Basel fairs, or do you think it particularly for Paris?
Well, I heard the main motivation for introducing this new VIP day was more about the venue itself. The Grand Palais, it's stunning, but it's much smaller in comparison to the convention centers that host Basel Miami or Basel Switzerland. And given the overwhelming interest in Basel Paris, last year the fair just felt overcrowded in that more relatively intimate space. So I think this was Basel's way of managing that issue. I think it worked well in that context, and while Miami and Switzerland are also very busy during their openings, to me at least, they never felt uncomfortably packed in their layouts. So I can understand why it maybe was more necessary for Paris. And meanwhile, I don't think it's something that's necessary for Miami or Basel, but because it was so successful in Paris, who knows? Maybe they'll try to implement it elsewhere. So let's talk a little bit about the market and sales at each of these fairs. Did you feel one was maybe stronger, more robust than the other? And overall, how were sales at the fairs?
Certainly, I think the distinction to draw mainly is obviously the one between the identity of Basel and Frieze, which is Basel. You are likely to see more blue chip sales at Basel than at Frieze, and that continued to be the case this year. And of course, these are sales that we reported on and were reported by galleries that I'm going to share. And I think, the most talked about sale on the opening day came a couple of hours into the fair at Paris, which was the Gerhard Richter painting, Abstract Bild from 1987. That was sold with an asking price of $23 million, House and Worth booth. And that was a huge transaction. It is in terms of reported sales, the most expensive reported sale at an Art Basel Paris fair since it launched in 2022. And I think that's kind of a really interesting point there in general. And it capped off a day of some really strong kind of seven-figure and some eight-figure sales too. White Cube, sorry about that. White Cube reported the sale of an $11.5 million Julie Moretu work. Pace Gallery reported a Modigliani painting for just under 10 million. And there were some other strong sales as well. Werner led its sales with $7.5 million sculpture from Ruse de Sawa. And these sales, kept flowing in throughout the Avant-Première day, and really underscored the fair's blue chip credentials. I think what is interesting about that is it will intensify conversations, not necessarily between Art Basel Paris and Frieze London, but between Art Basel Paris and Art Basel Basel in terms of the number of international exhibitors, the value of those transactions, and the number of those blue chip transactions. So I think that's an interesting narrative point to keep an eye on down the line. In terms of Frieze, yeah, as mentioned, the sales were anecdotally stronger last year. And I think the sales reflected, of course, the much more curated approach taken by a lot of galleries at the fair. For example, I mentioned Pace Gallery there at Art Basel Paris. Pace opted at the fair for a group booth of a lot of its leading roster artists, and resultingly had a lot of blue chip sales. Sold works by Agnes Martin, Mary Korth, Robert Nava, for 6 and 7 figure prices. Whereas at Frieze London and Frieze Masters, Pace opted to go for 2 solo presentations, one of William Monk, which they reported a number of sales for, some of which were in the 6-figure range, and Peter Hujar at Frieze Masters. Of course, the price points for those works were slightly lower, even if Pace, I'm not sure they mentioned, from between $25,000 to $45,000. So, yeah. So I think it's always worth mentioning that when comparing Art Basel Paris with Frieze London. There is a distinction there between price points, and that's reflected in the sort of presentations you see at both fairs. The identity of the two fairs really is kind of becoming more distinct the longer they coexist. But yes, ultimately, I think, the sales at Art Basel Paris were certainly felt and on a reported basis, seem to be deeper and stronger than in previous years, and with London as well. Anecdotally, seems to be better this year compared to last year.
So outside of the art fairs, there's so much happening during those few weeks in London and Paris. What would you say were some of the most talked about gallery and museum exhibitions in each city?
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, Adam. Because being a Londoner, I think maybe I have a kind of internalized sense of what was talked about. But certainly, Sadie Cole's opening the new gallery space on Savile Row, which is in Mayfair, with a show by Lisa Bryce, was certainly very talked about. As was the opening of 2 additional spaces, so Modern Art, Stuart Shea's gallery in St James's, which is just beneath Mayfair, and Ben Hunter opening a new space as well in St James's. But there are several kind of talked about shows from kind of established galleries as well, and institutions. So Kerry James Marshall at the Royal Academy was certainly very buzzy. Nigerian Modernism at the Tate Modern was another one that springs to mind. There was certainly a lot of shows that were being spoken about in London. Paris, I think mainly institutional shows were the ones that were generating the most buzz, at least from the people I spoke to. So Gerhard Richter at the Fondation Louis Vuitton was probably the most talked about show of the week, and certainly felt like the most. There was certainly a lot of Richter works at the fair as well. And also the other show in Paris, I think, was the minimal show at the Bourse de Commerce, which was yeah, certainly a standout, but also much discussed too. Yeah, how about yourself? Were there any shows that you caught or saw that spring to mind for you?
I think you highlighted most of the key shows. For me, the Kerry James Marshall exhibition at the Royal Academy in London really was the standout show across both cities. The exhibition just does an incredible job tracing how his practice has evolved and how many different subjects he's tackled in such inventive ways over the years. I definitely recommend it to our listeners. If you're in London or visiting London, don't miss it. And there also were a number of really exciting gallery shows up in London right now. Besides the Lisa Bryce exhibition that you mentioned at Sadie Cole's new space, I thought Dana Schutz's show at Thomas Stain was really fantastic. A young artist, Eva Helena Pade, made her UK solo debut at ROPAC. That was really beautiful.
Yeah.
Victor Mann's show at David Zorner was just incredible. Honestly, London's lineup felt really strong this year. And in Paris, everyone was talking about the Gerhard Richter exhibition at the Foundation Louis Vuitton. It felt like one of those shows you had to see, and if you told people that you didn't see it, it was kind of awkward to admit that.
Yeah.
It's one of the most comprehensive retrospectives I've seen in a long time. I mean, I remember walking through thinking it was already extensive and then realizing the next room started with works from 1985. I still had 40 more years to go.
Yeah,
I also really enjoyed the minimalist exhibition at Pino's Museum. The George Condo show at the Modern Art Museum was one that people were mentioning. Really across both cities, there was just an abundance of strong exhibitions. So now, after another year of Basel Paris, following Frieze London, what do you think was the key takeaway from these 2 weeks in Europe regarding London versus Paris? Do you think a real rivalry has started to form between these two cities?
So when Art Basel announced the Paris Fair a couple of years ago, it did spike immediate kind of conversations of London versus Paris, and this was spurred on by a number of kind of narrative threads, if you will. I think, which so for example, Brexit was just the vote was in 2016, but the agreement or the settlement was reached just shortly before that, and Brexit, as I'm sure has been discussed. I mean, as has been discussed several times on this podcast, is had an impact on the London art scene, and certainly had an impact on sentiment as well. Whilst Paris, on the other hand, was lots, as you mentioned before, Adam, like lots of galleries had expanded into the city. Of course, you had the Basel Fair and a number of kind of other additional art events taking place across the city. Auction houses expanding their presence there too. So that was quite, it made for kind of an interesting discussion about, as London kind of, floundered slightly, Paris, is Paris set to take on the kind of, the mantle? I think that kind of discussion now feels slightly tired, in my personal opinion. I think, of course, there are aspects to where the cities can be compared, but what was really striking to me this year, Adam, was that both cities offer such unique propositions to art lovers, collectors, and even galleries that are participating in the fairs there. This was a year in which Art Basel Paris and Frieze London felt the most distinct as fairs in terms of experience. My experience there as a viewer, from the presentations that the galleries brought, the kind of unique curatorial identities that each fair kind of is positioning itself at, and then again there is that point again with the gallery scenes. I mean, of course, Paris has a number of satellite fairs, Paris Internationale, some new ones like Seven Rue de Froissart, I believe. The pronunciation of French this podcast has been terrible, and I apologise for that. There were a number of satellite fairs there, and London satellite fairs like 154 and Minor Attractions, they feel different. And like I say, there's that they do feel very distinct. That's kind of my overarching kind of broad takeaway, which is that, yeah, I think they, Frieze London in particular, doubling down on curated sections, announcing things like artist to artist, Sheena Wagstaff's curated section studio within the fair. I think really doubling down on that more curated angle with Basel. If there is a distinction to be made there, really going for the sort of, you'd see much more group presentations, cross-roster presentations from galleries, as well as, of course, some curated sections too. But that would be the kind of overarching distinction there for me. Like I say, I think the other takeaway, I think, is less a takeaway and more of just a thought, which is, I think, a lot of the discussions going into the fair about Basel Paris be perhaps overtaking Basel in Basel as the premier fair in the company's portfolio is an interesting one. Whilst I don't think that's going to happen personally, or that is kind of going to take shape in that way, I do think there will be more conversations about that. We're likely to hear, I think. Yeah, but yeah, they're kind of my really broad stroke takeaways from the weeks.
Yeah, I agree. I think both London and Paris were really big successes, and I'm curious to see how next year's editions unfold. Arun, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast. We really appreciate you sharing some of your reporting from the 2 weeks, as well as your insights. And if our listeners don't already, they should definitely check out all of your coverage on Artsy. We really appreciate it.
Nice one. Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me on.